In the somber days of 922, a Muslim envoy crossing the lands of Rus came face to face with a horror that would forever haunt his soul. Ahmad Ibn Fadlan witnessed the dark rituals of Viking warriors upon a slave girl. Ultimately, she was set ablaze alongside their fallen leader's corpse. His vivid and terrifying descriptions, while reading like lines from a horror script, were every bit the truth. The events chronicled here reveal how the Vikings wielded sexuality as a weapon of conquest, a dark order of social control, and a sinister gateway to the afterlife. These shadows shaped the very soil of medieval Europe and left a legacy whose echoes of power would resound for centuries. The stories were so gruesome that some historians initially dismissed them as hostile exaggeration. From public couplings to sexual executions for entertainment, from ritualized acts where rape became a tool of systematic psychological torture to rituals conducted through human sacrifice, Viking sexual norms were designed as a dark display of power. A modern-day audience would be sickened. The evidence, compiled from sagas, archaeological findings, and first-hand testimonies, paints a portrait of a culture where violence and desire were inextricably woven together. Before we begin these dark stories, filled with pain and secrets hidden throughout history, if you have a passion for curiosity and discovery, liking and subscribing will allow us to uncover the cold secrets of the past together. Sharing where you're listening from in the comments will allow us to connect on this journey through time. In the Viking world, your sexual role determined whether you would be a respected member of society or condemned to live as an outcast. Power and dominance operated like a battle axe in every union. Arger and Ra. These two Norse terms were used to shame men who were considered sexually passive or effeminate. To be called Arger was such a great disgrace that Viking law justified revenge killings. So, if it was implied that you were passive in bed, you could kill the one who implied it and face no legal consequences. This brutal system strictly determined a sexual caste. The dominant one, who performed penetration, would retain his social status and masculinity, while the passive one would lose his manhood, legal protections, wealth, and place in society. In Viking culture, sexual position directly translated to social rank. The modern mind finds this absurd. Men who took the passive role lost their right to bear arms, serve as legal witnesses, and inherit property. Gossip behind closed doors could strip a man of his civic identity. Blood feuds began with sexual slander. In the Burnt and Jowl saga, a man's accusation of another's masculinity sparks a chain of revenge killings that leaves dozens dead. In Egil's saga, warriors cross countries to kill a man who questioned their masculinity. The slightest hint of sexual weakness could trigger a deadly chain, and women could use these insults as weapons. Norse literature speaks of wives who destroyed their husband's social status by questioning their potency in bed. In the Laxdæla saga, a woman divorces her husband and publicly shames him by declaring him soft sexually. This obsession with dominance created a self-perpetuating cycle of violence. Men were constantly forced to prove their masculinity through violence. This only escalated conflicts and demanded greater displays of control. Sexual power became a tool for maintaining social discipline. The stigma of weakness kept men loyal to the order and ensured that the Viking power hierarchy remained unquestionable. The Vikings didn't just practice sexual violence. They turned it into a weapon of psychological warfare. Humiliating a man could inflict a deeper wound than killing him. Some sagas speak of rituals like the shame strike, where the vanquished enemy's hips were cut or stabbed, symbolizing forced penetration. It wasn't random savagery. It was a symbolic emasculation that branded the victim as conquered in every sense. One reason this method was so effective was that the Vikings often didn't have to perform the act itself. Just the implication could destroy a person's life. But they often didn't settle for implication. Defeated leaders and warriors were subjected to ritual sexual assaults to drain their masculine energy and transfer it to their captors. The Foul Saga tells of captured kings being publicly raped to demonstrate their utter defeat. In a Viking mindset, Forcing a man to submit meant taking away his power and transferring it to the victor. The psychological wounds were permanent and intentional. When a man was repeatedly subjected to sexual violence, he could no longer return to his clan with honor. His people would exile him, culturally unmanning him, turning him into a dehumanized being who ruled over shadows. Some victims took their own lives rather than live with the shame, while others were banished into darkness, wandering as living monuments, curses of Viking supremacy. Sexual slavery was not just a means of pleasure, but a cold economic machine. The markets of Dublin and York were overflowing with captives dedicated to sexual exploitation. The sagas describe with a mortal coldness how raiders would separate people as if they were animals, setting aside the most beautiful for the dark pleasure of the warlord. The Vikings of Jarl Skeggi saga recounts how Sigurða kept Irish women as a harem, using them as disposable toys. The Viking legal system established a two-tiered order that would dwarf the most brutal inequalities of our time. Free women were under powerful legal protection from sexual assault, while enslaved women were completely defenseless. Any free man could use them, and killing a slave who resisted was considered only a minor offense. According to Icelandic laws, raping a freeborn woman carried the death penalty, while raping a female slave was considered equivalent to harming someone's animal. Excavations in Dublin revealed that up to 30% of the population was enslaved, and most of these were used specifically for sexual exploitation. This system was not only to provide pleasure, but was a strategic mechanism of fear. Rumors about Viking sexual cruelty would spread far ahead of their ships, and villages would surrender without a fight. The terrible fates awaiting those who rebelled were a weapon more deadly than steel, even as a mere threat. Even Viking marriages were filled with sexual rituals and public displays. Today's reality shows would seem innocent in comparison. Privacy was rare and not legally encouraged. The bride's family had to observe the couple's first sexual union and confirm that penetration had occurred. Without proof, the marriage could be annulled and the dowry could be reclaimed. The bride was forced to perform sexually in front of her in-laws. Privacy had become a legal obligation suppressed by shadow. Wedding rituals were woven with deep and open meanings. Thor's hammer placed in the bride's lap, a clear phallic symbol, represented her right to fertility. The priest would bless the hammer, allowing guests to touch it. This was a mass sexual ritual disguised as a religious one. The removal of the bride's crown by the groom was a symbolic and public declaration that he would take her virginity. The act of consumption would occur in the presence of family members waiting outside the door. The next morning, the bloodied sheets would be inspected, publicly proving the bride's virginity and the validity of the marriage. In some cases, trusted family members would be in the room to confirm the deed was done. In the Grettis saga, the bride's uncle stays in the room to provide this verification. The legal consequences were deadly serious. If the bride was not a virgin, her family could be sued for deception. If the groom failed to perform his duty, the bride's relatives could demand compensation for the missing goods. Icelandic laws list specific penalties for sexual shortcomings on the wedding night, with intimacy seen as a contractual business. All these customs were built on land, inheritance, and political agreements. Emotions were secondary. Love was just a luxury detail when dowries and bloodlines were at stake. Ahmad Ibn Fadlan's account is one of the most chilling anthropological documents. His description of Viking funerals has perplexed academics for generations, but archaeology has confirmed most of his descriptions. When a Viking chief died, his funeral would turn into several days of sexual rituals to transfer the energy of the living to the dead. The Norse believed that sexual vitality could be passed to the deceased through physical intimacy. Ibn Fadlan describes this process with almost cold-blooded precision. The tribe members would ask the chief's female slaves, "Which of you will die with him?" One would step forward, believing she would be her master's eternal companion in Valhalla. What followed was horrifying even compared to today's horror movies. The chosen slave girl would have sexual acts with many men in the community during her last days. Her body, as a blessed vessel, would be used to carry the collective essence of the tribe to death. The men would whisper to her, "I did this for our Lord out of love." They truly believed they were transferring spiritual power to the dead chief. The ritual would intensify each day, with the girl given increasing amounts of alcohol and drugs as she was passed from man to man. It was believed that each encounter added more spiritual energy to be transferred to the dead. On the day of the funeral, the girl would be brought to the ship and subjected to final sexual acts with 6 men. Each symbolized a different aspect of the tribe's strength. Ibn Fadlan's pen now acts like a cold observer as it describes the horror. The 6 men enter the shadow-filled tent and take their turns with her, each movement completing the ritual's cursed rhythm. Afterward, the slave girl is laid beside her dead master. Cold as stone, she now lies in the shadow of a corpse. The ritual's climax occurs with the cruel embrace of ropes and the dagger strikes of an old woman known as the Angel of Death. Breaths are cut, and life begins to fade like a flickering light. As the funeral ship rises in flames, the tribe shouts, hymns and screams mingling. They believe they have immortalized their chief with sexual power. Modern excavations have confirmed much of this dark practice. The remains of 2 women found in the Norwegian Oseberg ship burial show traces of a violent and terrible end. Other graves in Norse lands also show young women buried beside powerful men. Most indicate a ritual execution. The Vikings believed this was the highest honor. The slave girl would become a divine guide, carrying the soul and power of the tribe to the afterlife. But from a modern perspective, this appears as a systematic form of sexual violence camouflaged by religious cover. Viking culture created a paradox that would appall even modern feminists and conservative thinkers. Free Viking women had rights centuries ahead of the rest of the Middle Ages, but enslaved women were subjected to a brutality that would shadow even the darkest corners of history. Free Norse women could divorce their husbands, almost like returning a faulty product, because of their inadequacy. If a man could not satisfy his wife, if his endurance was insufficient or he was considered spiritually soft, the woman could legally separate and take her property. Women could inherit land, trade, and propose marriage to men they desired. The sagas tell of these women not only accumulating wealth, but also arranging marriages for their male relatives. Some had even gained social power as merchants and shipowners. Free women were protected from sexual assault. Norse laws limited unwanted touching, kissing, or intercourse with severe penalties. Consent was recognized as a legal concept. But these rights belonged only to free women. Enslaved women were property to be used as a free man saw fit. This contradiction was intentional and brutal. The rights of free women made the utter dehumanization of enslaved women even more visible. Viking women were not passive observers of their society's violence. Excavations show that some women took up arms as warriors. Sagas recount women encouraging their male relatives to inflict sexual cruelty upon their enemies. Women understood that their freedom was tied to supporting a system that kept others in chains. While adult Viking women could gain rights, infant girls often faced a dark fate. If families did not have the power to raise them, they would be abandoned and left in the wilderness. A small free female elite had real influence over society. Most other women lived under a ruthless tyranny. The Vikings' views on same-sex relations created a complex hierarchy. Homosexuality was not forbidden as long as the rules of sexual dominance were followed. Sagas speak of warriors who sought sexual experiences in distant lands. As long as the man maintained the dominant and penetrating role, his behavior was tolerated and even appreciated. Even Norse gods were caught in this web of sexual politics. Loki would be mocked for taking a female form and giving birth. Odin would be criticized for practicing effeminate traditional magic. Even the most powerful magical men were seen as sexually suspect. Viking law severely punished insults that implied a passive role. Men who exhibited effeminate behavior risked social ruin. The sharp and brutal pressure to prove masculinity permeated every drop of Viking life. It shaped the cut of clothing, occupations, and sacred rituals. The Vikings had turned sexual violence into a public spectacle. creating a stage reminiscent of today's gruesome reality shows. The justice system consecrated performance as much as punishment, and the law turned into a theatrical stage. Criminals were punished by being humiliated in front of society. Rapists would feel the echo of their violation in their own bodies, being publicly assaulted before execution, while spectators watched this as a dark, poetic justice. Adulterers would be castrated in front of the crowd. This was not just revenge, but a ritualized humiliation to reinforce social rank and provide a terrible entertainment for the audience. These horrific public punishments laid bare the power hierarchy, presenting the Vikings' ruthless nature in a socially approved form. The sagas describe sexual violence as part of planned festivals. Captured enemies were forced into humiliating acts in front of crowds. Spectators would bet on the victim's endurance. The sexual humiliation inflicted on prisoners would sometimes be increased until it led to death or mental collapse. Archaeological excavations confirm these narratives with terrifying accuracy. Execution sites show not just killing but planned and symbolic mutilations. This system, where sexual humiliation turned into entertainment, is a dark key that explains how Viking raiders could commit such widespread atrocities during their raids. The Vikings were not acting outside their cultural norms, but according to an approved and consecrated code. Sexual violence was not just tolerated, it was consecrated, turned into a terrifying performance art. This civilization had shaped sexuality, authority, and aggression by intertwining them like the sharp parts of a sword. This system was not random or spontaneous. It was a deliberate mechanism of control, turning sexuality into a weapon that enforced hierarchy and obedience. These practices, which seem brutal to a modern eye, were a structured process that shaped medieval Europe and still echo today through genetics, law, and concepts of masculinity. The Viking legacy was not limited to Scandinavia. It carried the concepts of sexuality, power, and dominance to every land it spread to, leaving its shadows on every culture it touched. What other civilizations with sexual traditions would contain similar horrors that would shake a modern audience?